In the gilded corridors of Valdoria Palace, where crown jewels catch the morning light and centuries-old portraits watch in silent judgment, two brothers stand on opposite sides of a chasm that no amount of royal protocol can bridge. When a leaked video surfaces showing the explosive final confrontation between Crown Prince Alexander and his younger brother Prince Marcus, it reveals the devastating moment that would tear apart not just a family, but shake the very foundations of the ancient Valdorian monarchy. Point of no return. The answer lies in a web of scandal, betrayal, and impossible choices that would force one prince into exile and leave the other questioning everything he thought he knew about duty, family, and the crown that awaits him. Tality, crystal chandelier trembled as Prince Alexander's fist slammed against the mahogany table, sending ripples through the untouched tea service that had grown cold hours ago. His younger brother Marcus stood with his back pressed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the autumn rain streak down the glass like tears on the face of Valdoria Palace itself. "You cannot be serious about this, Marcus." Alexander's voice carried the weight of 10 generations of royal authority. Yet beneath the commanding tone lay something far more vulnerable, the desperate plea of a brother watching his family crumble. The council meetings, the diplomatic incidents, the photographs with questionable associates. Now this business venture in Bahrain that nobody can properly explain. 38, Marcus turned from the window, his reflection ghost-like against the storm-darkened sky. At 38, he possessed the same sharp jawline and piercing blue eyes that had defined Valdorian royalty for centuries. But where Alexander carried himself with the measured dignity of a future king, Marcus moved with the restless energy of a man perpetually at odds with his destiny. Questionable associates? Marcus's laugh held no humor. Is that what Mother's calling them now? These are legitimate business partners, Alex. Real people building real companies in emerging markets, while you and the council sit here debating which fork to use at state dinners. The study, with its leather-bound volumes and oil paintings of long-dead monarchs, seemed to shrink around the two men. This room had witnessed countless royal conferences, declarations of war, and treaties that shaped nations. Today it would bear witness to the fracturing of a brotherhood that had weathered every storm until now. Alexander loosened his tie, a gesture that would have scandalized the Royal Protocol Office, but revealed the exhaustion etched into every line of his face. This isn't about business ventures, and you know it. The palace investigation team found irregularities, Marcus. Financial connections that trace back to groups we cannot publicly associate with the crown. Groups you cannot associate with, Marcus corrected, stepping away from the window. I'm the spare, remember? The insurance policy, the one who gets to cut ribbons at charity events while you prepare to rule an empire. The words hung in the air like accusations. Alexander had heard variations of this argument countless times over the past 2 years, ever since their father King Edward's health began declining and the weight of succession pressed more heavily on the elder prince's shoulders. But tonight felt different. Tonight carried the finality of a door closing. "That's not fair, and it's not true," Alexander said, his voice softer now, reaching for the brother he remembered rather than the stranger who seemed to inhabit Marcus's place. "You know how much I've valued your counsel, your support, the trade missions, the military service, the charitable work. You've been indispensable to the crown." Marcus ran his hands through his dark hair, a gesture Alexander recognized from their childhood, when mathematics homework proved particularly challenging. Some habits transcended decades, and royal protocol, indispensable until I became inconvenient, Marcus replied, until my friendships and business interests started generating negative headlines, until my presence at state functions became a liability rather than an asset. The ancient windows and product co-parks a conversation that both brothers had been avoiding for months. The royal communications team had been fielding increasingly difficult questions from international media about Prince Marcus's activities, photographs of him with controversial business figures, unconfirmed reports of financial dealings in politically sensitive regions, and whispered rumors of lifestyle choices that didn't align with traditional royal values. Alexander moved to the sideboard and poured 2 glasses of their father's favorite Scottish whiskey, a ritual that had marked important conversations throughout their lives. He offered one to Marcus, who accepted it with a nod of acknowledgement for the gesture if not agreement with its implications. "The Bahrain situation," Alexander began carefully. "The palace investigators say it's more complicated than a simple business investment. There are connections to organizations that our allies consider problematic. Marcus took a measured sip of the whiskey, tasting not just the smoky complexity of aged spirits, but the bitter flavor of accusations he couldn't fully deny. And you believe them? These investigators who report to the same council that would prefer I disappear entirely? I believe in protecting the monarchy, Alexander said, the words emerging with practiced authority. In 6 months, maybe less, I'll be king. Every decision I make, every association I maintain, every relationship I tolerate will reflect on the crown and the people we serve. The study's grandfather clock chimed 10 times, marking not just the late hour but the passage of time that had transformed two young princes who once built blanket forts and shared adventures into men standing on opposite sides of duty and desire. So this is it then, Marcus said. Not a question but a statement of resigned understanding. The royal version of cutting ties. Exile disguised as extended overseas business interests. Alexander set down his glass with trembling hands. It doesn't have to be permanent. If you could step back from these partnerships, if you could work with the palace communications team to address the concerns, if I could become the person you need me to be rather than who I am, Marcus finished. If I could pretend that my friendships and interests and opinions don't matter as much as preserving the pristine image of a monarchy that's increasingly irrelevant to ordinary people's lives. The accusation struck Alexander like a physical blow. Throughout his life, he had watched his brother struggle with the constraints of royal duty while secretly admiring Marcus's ability to form genuine connections outside the carefully controlled world of palace life. 3. Marcus had friends who called him by his first name, business partners who valued his insights rather than his title, and romantic relationships unburdened by protocols and public scrutiny. The people of Valdoria need stability, Alexander said, falling back on the arguments that had been drilled into him since childhood. They need to trust in institutions that transcend political trends and personal controversies. Marcus walked to the mahogany bookshelf that housed first editions of Valdorian history, running his fingers along leather spines that chronicled centuries of royal triumphs and failures. And what they're getting is a family so terrified of imperfection that we'd rather sacrifice one of our own than risk honest questions about our relevance. The silence that followed stretched between them like a chasm. Alexander wanted to argue, to present the careful reasoning that palace advisors had laid out in countless briefings. Instead, he found himself remembering summer afternoons when he and Marcus had explored every hidden passage and secret room in the palace, sworn to eternal brotherhood and convinced they could face any challenge together. The council meets tomorrow morning, Alexander said finally. They'll want a formal statement about your intentions regarding the Bahrain projects and your future role in official royal duties. Marcus nodded, understanding the subtext. Tomorrow morning he would either submit to palace control or face the consequences of continued independence. The choice framed as freedom felt more like a trap designed by people who had never risked anything more dangerous than serving lukewarm tea at a diplomatic reception. And if I choose Bahrain? Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. Bikarsa. Then you choose Bahrain over family, Alexander replied, the words emerging with more pain than he had intended to reveal. The brothers stood in the lamplight, surrounded by the artifacts of their shared heritage and the weight of decisions that would reshape their relationship forever. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the palace grounds, bending ancient trees and testing foundations that had weathered far worse than family disputes. Marcus finished his whiskey and set the crystal glass on the table with deliberate care. Peter, you know what the most tragic part of this is, Alex? I've never stopped believing in the monarchy. I've never stopped believing in our family's ability to serve something greater than ourselves. I just started believing that service might look different than endless committee meetings and scripted public appearances. Alexander wanted to respond, to bridge the gap that seemed to widen with every word, but found himself trapped between brotherly love and the inexorable demands of a crown he had never chosen but could never escape. The conversation continued deep into the night, two men wrestling with questions that had no easy answers, unaware that hidden cameras were recording every word, every gesture, every moment of a family's private anguish that would soon become very public indeed. As the storm outside began to subside, the tempest within Valdoria Palace was just beginning to reveal its true destructive power. The morning after the storm brought deceptive calm to Valdoria Palace, with golden sunlight streaming through the towering windows and painting the marble corridors in warm hues that masked the cold reality brewing within the ancient walls. Prince Alexander stood before the full-length mirror in his private chambers, adjusting the ceremonial uniform that would mark yet another day of royal obligations, each brass button and silk sash a reminder of the weight he carried as future king. His valet, Thomas, had served the royal family for 37 years and possessed an almost supernatural ability to read the emotional temperature of the palace. This morning, Thomas moved with particular care, sensing the tension that radiated from the crown prince like heat from a forge. "Your Highness, the council members have been arriving since dawn," Thomas said softly, laying out the day's agenda with practiced discretion. Lord Chancellor Whitmore requested a private audience before the formal session begins. Alexander nodded, knowing that Whitmore's request meant the palace's most senior advisors had already crafted their strategy for dealing with the Marcus situation. These were men and women who had navigated royal crises for decades, who understood that monarchy survived through careful management of public perception rather than messy family loyalty. Down the hallway, in the east wing that had always felt more like home than throne room, Prince Marcus sat at his laptop, reviewing financial documents that painted a picture far more complex than palace investigators had suggested. The Bahrain investments weren't just business ventures. They represented his vision of how modern royalty could engage with an evolving world economy while maintaining ethical standards that palace traditionalists seemed incapable of understanding. Marcus's private secretary, Elena Rodriguez, was one of the few palace employees who had earned his complete trust. Unlike the career courtiers who measured every word for political advantage, Elena spoke with refreshing directness that reminded Marcus why he valued relationships outside the royal bubble. "The media requests are multiplying," Elena said, setting down a stack of interview proposals and photograph requests from international publications. "Everyone wants to know about your future plans. The speculation is becoming more aggressive." Marcus closed his laptop and walked to the window overlooking the palace gardens, where he and Alexander had played as children, building elaborate adventure scenarios among the hedge mazes and fountain courtyards. Those memories felt simultaneously distant and immediate, like looking at photographs of strangers who happened to share his face. "Let them speculate," Marcus said, though his voice carried the weariness of someone who had grown tired of living under constant scrutiny. In 12 hours, speculation won't matter anymore. The morning council session convened in the sovereign's conference room, a chamber designed to intimidate with its soaring ceiling, gilded moldings, and portraits of monarchs whose stern expressions suggested they had never faced anything as mundane as family discord. Marie presided over the gathering with the authority of someone who had served 3 generations of royalty and considered himself the institutional memory of the crown. Alexander took his designated seat at the head of the mahogany table, flanked by advisors whose loyalty to the monarchy superseded any personal affection they might feel for individual family members. Defense Secretary Morrison, Communications Director Bennett, Treasury Minister Halifax, and Foreign Affairs Advisor Cumberland represented the various pillars of royal administration, each carrying briefing folders thick with analysis and recommendations. "Your Royal Highness," Whitmore began with formal courtesy that barely concealed his urgency, "the situation with Prince Marcus requires immediate resolution. Our sources indicate that certain media outlets may have obtained materials that could prove embarrassing to the crown." Patient. Alexander's blood chilled at the implication. What sort of materials? Communications Director Bennett leaned forward, her normally composed demeanor showing cracks of genuine concern. "We're not entirely certain, but our intelligence suggests recordings or documents related to the prince's business associations. The Palace Security Review revealed some concerning gaps in our monitoring protocols." The revelation hit Alexander like a physical blow. Palace security had been compromised, which meant that family conversations, private meetings, and confidential discussions might have been exposed to hostile scrutiny. The implications extended far beyond Marcus's individual situation to encompass the broader security of the monarchy itself. "How is this possible?" Alexander demanded, his carefully maintained composure beginning to fracture. "The palace has been swept regularly for surveillance equipment. Our communications are supposed to be secure." Defense Secretary Morrison cleared his throat with obvious discomfort. "Your Highness, the preliminary investigation suggests that the breach may have been facilitated by someone with intimate knowledge of palace protocols. An inside source with access to private areas typically considered beyond surveillance threats." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Someone within the trusted inner circle of palace staff, advisors, or even family members, had betrayed the confidentiality that formed the foundation of royal operations. The violation felt personal and institutional simultaneously, striking at the heart of relationships that had been built over years of shared service and mutual trust. Meanwhile, 3 floors below in the palace's media monitoring center, technicians were tracking the digital footprint of a video file that had begun circulating through encrypted networks used by investigative journalists and opposition political organizations. The file's metadata suggested professional recording equipment and sophisticated editing, indicating resources beyond typical tabloid operations. Marcus had been excluded from the morning council session, a deliberate choice that sent its own message about his current standing within the royal hierarchy. Instead, he spent the morning in his private office, fielding calls from business partners in Bahrain who were growing increasingly concerned about the political implications of their association with Valdorian royalty. Your Highness, the consortium is reconsidering the timeline for our renewable energy projects, explained Dr. Khalid al-Rashid, whose engineering firm had pioneered solar technologies that Marcus believed could revolutionize energy infrastructure across developing nations. Surrounding your family situation is creating complications with our government partners. Marcus understood the subtext. His business associates, who had valued his royal connections and international credibility, were now viewing those same attributes as liabilities. The irony wasn't lost on him that his efforts to use royal influence for progressive business purposes were being undermined by palace fears about progressive business purposes. Dr. al-Rashid, I appreciate your honesty, Marcus replied. Within the next few days, my relationship with the Valdorian crown will be clarified one way or another. Your projects are too important to be derailed by temporary political complications. The conversation continued for 20 minutes, touching on technical specifications for solar installations and regulatory frameworks for international energy partnerships. These discussions reminded Marcus why he had been drawn to business ventures that offered tangible benefits to real people rather than ceremonial duties that generated headlines but little meaningful change. Back in the conference room, the council session was reaching its crucial phase. Lord Chancellor Whitmore had laid out 3 possible approaches to managing the Marcus crisis: complete severance of official ties, temporary suspension of royal duties with possibility of reinstatement, or intensive public relations management to rehabilitate his image. Palace's complete cooperation with palace communications strategy, Bennett explained. He would need to end all questionable business relationships, submit to comprehensive media training, and accept permanent oversight of his future activities. Alexander listened to the clinical discussion of his brother's fate with growing revulsion. These advisors spoke about Marcus as if he were a public relations problem rather than a family member, reducing complex human motivations to bullet points in strategic planning documents. Has anyone considered that Marcus might have valid reasons for his choices? Alexander asked, surprising himself with the question. That perhaps our approach to royal duties needs examination rather than simply demanding conformity from family members who see different possibilities. The room's atmosphere shifted perceptibly. Several advisors exchanged glances that suggested the Crown Prince was straying from acceptable discussion parameters. Lord Chancellor Whitmore's expression hardened with disapproval that had intimidated lesser royals for decades.
Your Royal Highness, Whitmore said with measured formality, the Crown's stability depends on consistent application of established protocols.
Individual preferences cannot supersede institutional requirements, regardless of family relationships or personal sympathies. Alexander felt the weight of centuries pressing down on his shoulders, the accumulated expectations of generations who had sacrificed personal desires for royal duty, that bale of crowns, that prominent. Yet for the first time in his life, he found himself questioning whether duty required the sacrifice of everyone he cared about in service to an institution that seemed increasingly disconnected from the people it claimed to serve. The session continued past noon, with advisors presenting detailed analyses of public opinion polling, media coverage trends, and international diplomatic considerations that would be affected by the royal family's internal decisions. Each presentation reinforced the same conclusion. Marcus's continued association with the crown posed unacceptable risks to monarchical stability. As the afternoon approached, neither brother realized that their private conversation from the previous evening had already begun its journey toward public exposure, carried by encrypted files and secure communications networks that would soon deliver their family's most intimate moments to a world hungry for royal scandal. The palace's carefully constructed facade of unity was about to face its greatest test, and the brothers who had once believed they could weather any storm together were about to discover just how destructive the winds of public scrutiny could become. The leak arrived at precisely 3:47 in the afternoon, delivered to the newsroom of the International Herald Tribune through an encrypted email account that would later prove untraceable. Senior editor Margaret Thornfield had been covering royal affairs for 2 decades, but she had never encountered material quite like the video file that appeared on her secure server with nothing more than a timestamp and the cryptic message, the real story behind the Valdorian succession crisis. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she opened the file on an isolated computer system, her journalistic instincts warring with professional ethics about invasion of privacy. Video quality was remarkably clear, suggesting professional surveillance equipment rather than amateur recording. What she witnessed in the following 43 minutes would reshape her understanding of the Valdorian royal family and challenge everything the public believed about the unity of the crown. The footage showed Prince Alexander and Prince Marcus in what appeared to be a private study, their body language revealing a level of emotional intensity that contradicted years of carefully orchestrated public appearances. Margaret watched the brothers argue with raw honesty about duty, family loyalty, and the crushing weight of royal expectations, their voices carrying pain that no amount of media training could disguise. "This changes everything," Margaret whispered to her empty office, understanding immediately that she held material capable of destroying the Valdorian monarchy's carefully maintained image of dignified stability. The conversation revealed not just family discord but fundamental disagreements about the crown's purpose in an evolving world. 3,000 miles away, Prince Marcus was ending his final meeting with Bahrain business partners when his personal phone buzzed with an urgent message from Elena Rodriguez. The text contained only a phone number and the words, "Call immediately. Private line." Marcus excused himself from the conference room where renewable energy contracts lay spread across polished tables like blueprints for a future that suddenly seemed less certain. "Elena, what's happening?" Marcus asked, stepping onto a private balcony overlooking the Persian Gulf where construction cranes marked the skyline like mechanical prayers reaching toward progress. "Your Highness, I've received calls from 3 different media outlets in the past hour." Elena's voice carried a tension that Marcus had never heard before. "They're asking very specific questions about your conversation with Prince Alexander last night. Details that suggest they have access to information they shouldn't possess." Marcus felt the warm Bahrain air turn cold against his skin as the implications settled into his consciousness. Someone had been recording his most private moments with his brother, capturing family pain for public consumption. The violation felt more intimate and damaging than any tabloid photograph or speculative article about his business relationships. "How specific are these questions?" Marcus asked, though he dreaded the answer. Elena's pause stretched across the international connection like a held breath. "They're asking about whiskey glasses, grandfather clocks, and exact quotes from your discussion about duty versus personal freedom. Someone was in that room with you, or someone had access to very sophisticated surveillance equipment." Marcus closed his eyes and leaned against the balcony railing, watching the sun reflect off glass towers that represented his vision of modern progress, while his family's private agony was being packaged for global entertainment. Irony struck him that he had come to Bahrain seeking freedom from royal constraints, only to discover that those constraints had followed him through hidden cameras and encrypted files. Back at Valdoria Palace, the afternoon council session had been interrupted by Communications Director Bennett bursting through the conference room doors with unprecedented urgency. Protocol demanded formal announcements and proper decorum, but crisis management sometimes required abandoning diplomatic niceties. "Your Royal Highness, we have a situation," Bennett announced, her professional composure completely shattered. "Multiple news organizations are reporting that they have obtained video footage of a private conversation between yourself and Prince Marcus. The preliminary descriptions suggest highly sensitive material." Alexander felt the room tilt around him, as if the ancient palace foundations had shifted beneath his feet. And the careful strategies and measured responses that had dominated the morning's discussions suddenly seemed pathetically inadequate for the reality they now faced. Private family conversations were about to become public entertainment, dissected by political commentators and analyzed by experts who had never experienced the weight of a crown or the burden of impossible choices. What exactly do they have? Alexander demanded, his voice carrying a royal authority that couldn't mask his underlying desperation. Bennett consulted her tablet with trembling fingers, reading from preliminary reports that painted a devastating picture. The footage from last night's meeting in your private study. Audio quality appears excellent. The conversation reportedly includes discussions about Prince Marcus's business relationships, palace investigations, and disagreements about royal duties and family loyalty. Lord Chancellor Whitmore leaned back in his leather chair as if physical distance could protect him from the approaching storm. How long before publication? Unknown, Your Highness. The major outlets are likely conducting verification processes and seeking palace comment before proceeding. We may have hours, possibly until tomorrow morning, before the story breaks internationally. The conference room fell silent, except for the steady tick of an antique clock that had measured time for royal crises across centuries. Each second brought them closer to a moment when private pain would become public spectacle, when family disagreements would be transformed into constitutional crises by experts who had never worn a crown or carried the weight of generational responsibility. Treasury Minister Halifax spoke first, his voice carrying the clinical detachment of someone accustomed to managing financial rather than emotional disasters. The immediate concern is market stability. The royal scandals traditionally trigger currency fluctuations and investor uncertainty. We should prepare contingency plans for economic fallout. Alexander stared at the minister with growing horror, realizing that his family's private agony was being reduced to charts and graphs, risk assessments, and damage control strategies that treated human relationships like market commodities. With respect, Minister Halifax, Alexander said slowly, my primary concern is not currency fluctuations. My primary concern is that someone violated the privacy of the royal family for reasons we don't yet understand, and my brother is about to be publicly humiliated for having honest conversations about impossible choices. The room's atmosphere shifted as advisors recognized a tone they had rarely heard from the typically diplomatic crown prince. Alexander's composure was cracking under the pressure of watching his family's private struggles being prepared for public consumption by people who had never risked anything more significant than their professional reputations. Foreign Affairs Advisor Cumberland cleared her throat diplomatically. Your Royal Highness, while the personal violation is deeply regrettable, we must consider the broader implications for Valdoria's international relationships. Several allied nations have been questioning Prince Marcus's business associations. This footage could either vindicate our position or create new complications depending on how the conversation is interpreted. Alexander stood abruptly, pacing to the tall windows that overlooked gardens where he and Marcus had once believed they could conquer any challenge through brotherhood and determination. The afternoon light streaming through ancient glass seemed to illuminate the distance between those innocent dreams and the harsh reality of royal life in an age of digital surveillance and instant global communication. Have we located Prince Marcus? Alexander asked, understanding that his brother needed to know about the leak before discovering it through news reports that would inevitably sensationalize and distort their private conversation. Bennett checked her communications devices again. In present meetings. Our embassy staff can reach him within the hour if instructed. The decision felt monumental despite its apparent simplicity. Calling Marcus would mean acknowledging that their family's private pain was about to become public entertainment, that years of carefully maintained royal dignity were about to be shattered by 43 minutes of honest conversation between brothers who had forgotten to guard against electronic eavesdroppers. Make the call, Alexander decided. Marcus deserves to hear this from family before he hears it from journalists. As Bennett left the conference room to coordinate international communications, the remaining advisors began crafting response strategies that would attempt to control narrative damage while preserving what remained of royal authority. Their discussions focused on legal options, public relations approaches, and political implications that reduced human complexity to manageable policy decisions. Meanwhile, in a downtown London office building, Margaret Thornfield was conducting her own ethical review of the material she had received. The video revealed genuine human emotions and family struggles that deserved privacy, yet it also exposed potential conflicts of interest and institutional problems that arguably served the public interest to understand. Her editor-in-chief, David Walsh, brought 30 years of experience navigating the treacherous waters between press freedom and personal privacy. Margaret, what's your professional assessment? Is this legitimate public interest journalism or invasion of privacy masquerading as news? Margaret rewound portions of the video, studying the brothers' expressions and body language with the analytical skills that had made her one of Europe's most respected royal correspondents. David, this footage reveals fundamental disagreements about the monarchy's role in contemporary society. These aren't just personal family arguments, they're constitutional questions with implications for millions of people who live under Valdorian authority. The newspaper faced a decision that would define its reputation for integrity while potentially reshaping public understanding of modern monarchy. As the afternoon dissolved into evening, powerful institutions and individual lives hung in the balance of editorial choices being made in newsrooms around the world, each decision carrying consequences that would ripple through international politics and family relationships that had already been strained beyond their breaking point. The storm that had passed over Valdoria Palace the previous night had been merely weather. The tempest approaching now would test foundations that had been built over centuries and challenge relationships that both brothers had believed were stronger than any force the modern world could unleash against them. The phone call that would change everything began at 7:28 in the evening Bahrain time, as Prince Marcus stood in his hotel suite watching the sunset over Manama Bay while the weight of revelation crushed down on him like the collapse of everything he had believed about family loyalty and institutional trust and security. Prince Alexander's voice carried across the international connection with a hollowness that spoke to more than just digital compression. "Marcus, I need you to sit down," Alexander said without preamble, abandoning the diplomatic protocols that had structured their conversations for months. "Someone recorded our discussion last night. The footage is about to become public." Marcus felt his legs buckle, forcing him to grip the marble windowsill as his carefully constructed world shifted beneath him. The business meetings, the renewable energy projects, the vision of using royal connections for progressive change, all of it suddenly seemed naive compared to the brutal reality of modern media warfare. "How much did they get?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer would be devastating. "Everything," Alexander replied, his voice cracking with exhaustion and defeat. "The whiskey, the arguments about duty and family, your plans for Bahrain, my concerns about the palace investigations. 43 minutes of our most honest conversation in years, and now it's going to be dissected by people who've never carried the weight of a crown or understood what it means to choose between family and institution." Marcus closed his eyes and tried to process the violation that extended beyond simple invasion of privacy to encompass a betrayal of trust that went to the heart of everything he had believed about the sanctuary of family relationships. Someone had weaponized their pain, transforming brotherly honesty into public entertainment. "Who?" Marcus asked simply, understanding that the identity of the betrayer mattered almost as much as the betrayal itself. Alexander's pause stretched across continents, carrying the weight of suspicions that neither brother wanted to voice. "We don't know yet. The palace security review is ongoing, but the equipment required suggests professional surveillance with inside knowledge of our routines and private spaces. The implications hung between them like accusations neither could bear to examine too closely. Palace security breaches of this magnitude required either spectacular incompetence or deliberate facilitation by someone with intimate access to royal family routines and locations." In Valdoria's capital city, protesters had already begun gathering outside the palace gates despite the evening hour, drawn by social media reports that something significant was developing in the royal crisis that had dominated news cycles for weeks. The crowd remained peaceful but determined, carrying signs demanding transparency and accountability from institutions that had traditionally operated beyond public scrutiny. Helena Morrison, a university student studying constitutional law, held a placard reading "Royal Privacy versus Public Interest" while live-streaming the gathering for her social media followers. "We're here because we believe the monarchy needs to be transparent about conflicts that affect how our country is governed," she explained to her phone camera. "If members of the royal family are having fundamental disagreements about their roles and responsibilities, the people deserve to understand what that means for our future." The sentiment reflected a generational divide that palace advisors had been struggling to address for years. Younger Valdorians increasingly viewed royal privacy as a luxury that came at the expense of democratic accountability, while traditionalists argued that institutional stability required protection of family relationships from public interference. Back in the Palace Communications Center, Director Bennett was coordinating response strategies with an international team of crisis management specialists who had been summoned from across Europe to address the unprecedented situation. The room buzzed with controlled urgency as analysts tracked social media sentiment, monitored international news coverage, and prepared statements that would attempt to shape public interpretation of the leaked footage. The preliminary polling data suggests public opinion is divided along predictable demographic lines, reported senior analyst Dr. Sarah Pembroke, her charts and graphs reducing complex human emotions to statistical trends. Older respondents view the leak as an unacceptable invasion of privacy, while younger demographics see it as legitimate transparency about royal decision-making processes. Then it studied the data with professional detachment while privately wrestling with personal sympathies for family members whose private pain was being transformed into political theater. What about international reaction? Mixed but intense, Dr. Berger, Pembroke replied, consulting multiple screens displaying global news coverage and diplomatic communications. Allied monarchies are expressing solidarity with Valdorian royal privacy, while Republican governments are calling for greater transparency in royal succession planning. The business community is particularly focused on Prince Marcus's Bahrain investments and their potential political implications. The global nature of the crisis reflected the interconnected world that had made Marcus's international business ventures possible, while simultaneously ensuring that royal family disputes could no longer remain domestic matters. A modern monarchy operated on an international stage where family arguments became diplomatic incidents and personal choices carried geopolitical consequences. Meanwhile, in a secure facility outside London, intelligence analysts were conducting their own review of the leaked footage, searching for clues about its origins and the motivations behind its release. The sophisticated nature of the surveillance equipment suggested resources beyond typical tabloid operations, raising questions about whether foreign governments or domestic political organizations might have orchestrated the breach. The audio quality indicates professional-grade recording equipment positioned strategically throughout the room, explained technical specialist Robert Chen, his computer screens displaying waveform analyses and acoustic modeling that revealed uncomfortable truths about palace security vulnerabilities. This wasn't opportunistic recording. Someone planned this operation with detailed knowledge of the prince's meeting patterns and preferred locations. The investigation was revealing a picture of systematic surveillance that extended far beyond the single recorded conversation, suggesting that royal family privacy had been compromised for an unknown period by unknown actors with unknown objectives. The violation felt institutional as well as personal, challenging fundamental assumptions about security protocols that had protected the monarchy for generations. Prince Marcus had ended his call with Alexander and was now pacing his hotel suite while Elena Rodriguez fielded an avalanche of media requests from international outlets seeking comment on developing stories that promised to reshape public understanding of royal family dynamics. Each call revealed more details about how global news organizations were preparing to present the leaked footage to audiences hungry for insider access to royal controversy. Your Highness, the BBC is reporting that they expect to have verification of the footage within hours, Elena said, reading from encrypted communications with palace staff who were monitoring international media coverage. Several European networks are already running preview coverage about upcoming royal revelations. Marcus understood that he was watching the final hours of his life as he had known it. Tomorrow morning, his most private thoughts and family struggles would be available for global consumption, analyzed by experts who had never experienced the weight of royal duty or the crushing burden of choosing between personal fulfillment and institutional loyalty. The business partners who had valued his royal connections would distance themselves from the controversy. The charitable organizations that had benefited from his patronage would face difficult decisions about continued association with a prince whose reputation was about to be defined by leaked footage rather than years of dedicated service. Elena, I want you to prepare statements for our business partners and charitable affiliations, Marcus said, moving to his laptop where emails were accumulating faster than he could process them. They need to know that I understand if they choose to suspend our relationships until this situation resolves itself. Elena's expression reflected the sadness of watching someone she respected prepare for professional and personal exile. Your Highness, many of these relationships have developed over years. Perhaps some partners will value loyalty over temporary negative publicity. Marcus appreciated her optimism while recognizing its limitations. Business relationships, even those involving royalty, operated according to risk management principles that made continued association with controversial figures financially imprudent, regardless of personal loyalties or past contributions. As midnight approached in Valdoria, palace staff were working through the night to prepare for a media storm that would begin with morning news programs and continue indefinitely as the leaked footage was analyzed, interpreted, and debated by commentators around the world. The carefully orchestrated image of royal unity was about to be replaced by unfiltered access to family conflict that revealed the human cost of institutional preservation. Prince Alexander stood in his private quarters, staring at photographs of happier times when he and Marcus had believed their brotherhood was strong enough to overcome any challenge the world might present. Tomorrow, those memories would be complicated by public knowledge of their most painful disagreements, their private struggles transformed into constitutional debates and political commentary. The brothers who had once shared secrets and dreams were about to discover what happened when family intimacy became global entertainment, when personal pain was transformed into public policy discussions, and when the sanctuary of brotherhood was violated by forces neither had anticipated or prepared to resist. The night before revelation stretched ahead of them, like a final opportunity for privacy that both knew they would never experience again. As the world prepared to judge not just their individual choices, but the very nature of modern monarchy in an age that demanded transparency from institutions built on centuries of carefully guarded discretion. The morning of revelation arrived with deceptive normalcy across Valdoria. Citizens woke to routine breakfast preparations and commuter schedules, unaware that their understanding of royal family dynamics was about to be fundamentally altered by 43 minutes of footage that would transform private family pain into constitutional crisis and international diplomatic incident. At exactly 6:15 in the morning, the International Herald Tribune published its exclusive report under the headline, "Royal Brothers at Breaking Point, Leaked Video Reveals Palace Crisis Behind Closed Doors." Within minutes, the story had been picked up by news organizations across 3 continents, each adding their own analysis and interpretation to footage that captured the human cost of institutional preservation with devastating clarity. Margaret Thornfield had spent the night crafting an article that balanced journalistic responsibility with respect for human dignity, but she understood that her careful analysis would soon be overwhelmed by commentary from experts who had never experienced the weight of royal duty or the crushing burden of choosing between family loyalty and institutional stability. The footage reveals not just personal family discord, Margaret had written, but fundamental philosophical differences about the monarchy's role in contemporary society. Prince Marcus's arguments for modernization and international business engagement clashed directly with Prince Alexander's concerns about institutional stability and traditional royal responsibilities. Within hours, social media platforms were flooded with clips, commentary and analysis that reduced complex human emotions to viral content and political ammunition. Hashtags like #RoyalTruth and #PalaceCrisis trending globally as millions of people gained unprecedented access to conversations that had never been intended for public consumption. So Prince Alexander received the first notification at 6:37 in the morning, when Communications Director Bennett called his private line with the flat professional tone that palace staff used to deliver devastating news without betraying personal emotions. "Here, Your Royal Highness. The story has broken simultaneously across multiple platforms," Bennett reported. Initial coverage focuses on the family conflict, but analysis pieces are already examining constitutional implications and succession planning concerns. Alexander sat on the edge of his bed, still wearing the clothes from the previous evening when sleep had become impossible, and tried to process the reality that his most private thoughts were now being discussed by strangers around the world. The violation felt physical, as if his emotional landscape had been excavated and displayed for public examination. "What's the immediate reaction?" Alexander asked, though he dreaded hearing confirmation of what he already suspected. Bennett's pause carried the weight of monitoring reports that painted a picture of global fascination with royal vulnerability. "Mixed but intense, Your Highness. Social media engagement is extraordinarily high. Traditional media outlets are running continuous coverage. Several political organizations are calling for formal inquiries into royal decision-making processes." The transformation of private pain into political opportunity had begun before the sun had fully risen. As opposition parties seized on leaked footage to advance arguments about monarchical relevance and democratic accountability that had been developing for years beneath the surface of constitutional stability. Meanwhile, Prince Marcus was discovering the global nature of modern scandal as his phone buzzed with international calls from business partners, charitable organizations, and diplomatic contacts who were scrambling to understand how the leaked footage would affect their relationships with Valdorian royalty. Khalid al-Rashid called from Bahrain at 7:45 in the morning, his voice carrying the careful diplomacy of someone navigating between personal loyalty and professional survival.
Your Highness, I've been monitoring the international coverage.
The consortium needs to understand how this development might affect our renewable energy projects. Marcus understood the subtext immediately. Business relationships that had seemed solid were now subject to political calculations that extended far beyond individual personalities or project merits. His royal connections, which had opened doors and facilitated partnerships, were becoming liabilities that threatened everyone associated with his ventures. Dr. al-Rashid, I appreciate your directness, Marcus replied, looking out over Manama Bay where construction projects continued despite the political storm gathering around their royal partner. I suggest the consortium proceed with your projects based on their technical merits rather than royal associations. The work you're doing is too important to be derailed by temporary controversies. The conversation continued for 20 minutes, touching on technical specifications and regulatory frameworks, while both men navigated the unspoken reality that Marcus's involvement had become a complication rather than an asset. By the call's end, Marcus understood that his carefully constructed vision of progressive royal engagement was crumbling along with his family relationships. Back at Valdoria Palace, Lord Chancellor Whitmore was convening an emergency session that would determine the monarchy's official response to the most serious crisis in generations. The conference room, filled with advisors who had managed royal communications through scandals and celebrations, but none had faced the challenge of addressing authentic footage that revealed the genuine complexity of royal decision-making processes. The immediate priority is damage control, Whitmore announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had preserved royal dignity through decades of potential crises. We need statements that acknowledge the footage while maintaining institutional stability and family unity. Foreign Affairs Advisor Cumberland consulted briefing papers that analyzed diplomatic implications extending far beyond Valdorian borders. Several allied monarchies have expressed concern about the precedent this sets for royal privacy. The Swedish and Danish courts are particularly worried about the implications for their own family situations. The crisis was revealing the interconnected nature of European monarchy, where precedents established in one kingdom could affect constitutional relationships across the continent. Royal privacy, traditionally protected by mutual agreement among constitutional monarchies, was being challenged by digital technology and changing public expectations about institutional transparency. Treasury Minister Halifax presented economic analyses that reduced human relationships to market indicators and financial projections. Early trading shows currency fluctuations consistent with political uncertainty. International investors are seeking clarification about succession planning and institutional stability. Of his family's destruction, with growing revulsion, understanding that these advisors viewed the leaked footage primarily as a management problem rather than a human tragedy that had torn apart relationships built over decades of shared experience and mutual dependence. Has anyone considered, Alexander said slowly, that perhaps the public deserves to understand the real complexity of royal decision-making? But maybe transparency about family struggles and institutional challenges might strengthen rather than weaken public support for the monarchy. The room fell silent as advisors processed a suggestion that challenged fundamental assumptions about royal communication strategy. For generations, palace policy had emphasized dignity, unity, and carefully controlled public access to family dynamics that supported, rather than complicated, constitutional stability. News Director Bennett was the first to respond, her professional instincts warring with recognition that traditional approaches might be inadequate for contemporary media landscapes. Your Royal Highness, authentic transparency carries significant risks. Public exposure of family conflicts could undermine the institutional unity that supports constitutional monarchy. Alexander stood and walked to the tall windows that had framed countless royal crises throughout history. understanding that he was facing a moment that would define not just his own future, but the monarchy's relationship with an evolving society that increasingly demanded honest communication from institutions that had traditionally operated beyond public scrutiny. Perhaps, Alexander said quietly, the institutional unity that requires family destruction isn't worth preserving. The words hung in the air like a constitutional revolution, challenging assumptions that had guided royal policy for centuries, while acknowledging that modern monarchy might require different approaches to family relationships and public communication than previous generations had imagined necessary or desirable. Meanwhile, across social media platforms and news networks, public opinion was crystallizing around the leaked footage in ways that revealed deep divisions about royal relevance, family privacy, and institutional accountability. Younger demographics expressed support for Prince Marcus's arguments about modernization and international engagement, while traditionalists rallied around Prince Alexander's concerns about institutional stability and constitutional responsibility. Helena Morrison, the constitutional law student who had organized the previous evening's protest, was live-streaming analysis of the footage that positioned royal family conflict within broader questions about democratic accountability and hereditary privilege. What we're seeing, Helena explained to her growing online audience, is a fundamental disagreement about whether royal families should operate like private families, with public duties, or public institutions with private moments. Prince Marcus seems to argue for treating royalty like international business leaders who happen to have titles, while Prince Alexander maintains the traditional view that royal duty supersedes personal preferences. The analysis reflected sophisticated understanding of constitutional theory that suggested younger generations were prepared to engage with monarchy as a political institution rather than accepting it as an inherited tradition beyond democratic examination. By midday, the leaked footage had been viewed by millions of people worldwide, generating commentary and analysis that extended far beyond simple entertainment value to encompass serious questions about constitutional monarchy, family loyalty, and institutional adaptation to contemporary social expectations. Prince Marcus, still in Bahrain but increasingly isolated from the business relationships that had brought him there, made the decision that would define the remainder of his royal career. He called Elena Rodriguez with instructions that would sever his official ties to the crown, while potentially preserving what remained of his family relationships. Elena, I want you to draft a statement announcing my withdrawal from all official royal duties and my intention to pursue private business interests without palace oversight or royal patronage, Marcus said, his voice carrying the calm resolution of someone who had finally accepted the inevitable. The decision represented complete capitulation to palace pressure, while simultaneously asserting the personal freedom that had motivated his original conflicts with royal expectations. By choosing exile disguised as voluntary withdrawal, Marcus was preserving his brother's position while sacrificing his own claims to royal relevance and family connection. The statement would be released within hours, marking the end of a royal career that had been built on hopes for progressive engagement with contemporary challenges, while acknowledging that modern monarchy might not possess the flexibility required to accommodate genuine diversity of opinion within royal family ranks. As the sun set over both Valdoria Palace and Manama Bay, two brothers who had once believed their relationship was strong enough to overcome any challenge faced the reality that institutional preservation had ultimately required family sacrifice, that royal duty had demanded the destruction of brotherly loyalty, and that the leaked footage would forever document the moment when private pain became public entertainment in service to constitutional stability, that both had served but only one would continue to represent. The crisis that had begun with hidden cameras and encrypted files was ending with official statements and diplomatic distances that would reshape not just individual lives but public understanding of monarchy's human cost, in an age that demanded transparency from institutions built on centuries of carefully guarded privacy, and family unity that had proven more fragile than either brother had ever imagined possible.